19 years I had stood the St. Vesper crossing, and in all that time I had never once seen a child refuse to wave. That is the thing they do not tell you when you take the oath of the King's Guard. They tell you about the bearskin and the weight of it, about the way the chinstrap cuts a line under your jaw by the third hour, about the rifle and the white gloves and the medals you are permitted to wear, and the ones you are not. They drill you in the freeze and the recovery, in the precise 11-inch heel snap of the slow march, in keeping your eyes level and your face a closed door no matter what crosses your path. They tell you the crowd is a sea and you are the rock, and that the rock does not notice the sea. What they do not tell you is that after enough years the sea stops being a blur. After enough years you know it. You know the rhythm of a crowd the way a sailor knows water, when it is happy, when it is bored, when it is about to surge a barrier. And on a Founding Day morning, the children at the front of that crowd are the most predictable creatures on earth. They wave. Every one of them, the whole length of the processional, 500,000 strong, and at the front a bright ragged line of small hands going back and forth, like reeds in a wind that only blows one way. So when I saw a little girl with her hand flat and still against the iron barrier, not waving, not moving, pressed there as if she were trying to hold the railing down, I noticed. I want to be honest about the order of things, because the order is the whole story. I did not stop the parade because a child looked at me. Children look at me all day. It is half my work to be looked at. I stopped the parade because of what came after the look, and to understand what came after you have to understand the morning, and the crossing, and the thing about the horses that nobody on that avenue knew except me and perhaps 3 other men in the Kingdom of Eldermoor. My name is Corwen Hale. On the day this happened, I was a sergeant of the King's Guard, 46 years old, and the senior man on the St. Vesper crossing, which is to say the point where the great processional bends around the old fountain, and the whole mounted column has to slow, turn, and pass within 40 feet of the Royal Reviewing Stand before it straightens out again for the run to Harrowgate Palace. It is the prettiest spot on the route and the most dangerous, and the two facts are not unrelated. Founding Day in Eldermoor is the morning the Royal House of Harrowgate rides the length of the capital in open carriage and on horseback, from the cathedral steps to the palace gates, to mark the founding of the realm. Queen Saralind rides it every year. She could ride clothed and armored, and no one would think less of her. Instead, she rides where the people can see her face, because she says a crown that hides from its own founding day is not worth the weight of it. That year she rode in the open landau with the prince consort, Aldrich, beside her, and behind them, on 2 gray ponies that had been chosen and gentled for exactly this purpose, rode the 2 children of the house, Prince Joran, who was 10 and sat his pony like he had been born on it, and Princess Malin, who was 8 and had not, and who gripped her reins with the white-knuckled solemnity of a girl who has been told all week that the whole kingdom will be watching. I tell you who was in the column, because it matters where the column was going. It was going past my crossing, around the fountain, under the great reviewing stand, with the children on their ponies in the most exposed 40 feet of the entire route. The morning had come up gray and then broken gold, the way our autumn mornings do, the sun cutting under the cloud and laying a sheet of cold light along the wet cobblestones so the whole avenue glittered. I had been on post since before dawn. The crowd had filled in behind the barriers by 7, 4 and 5 deep, then 6, then a wall of coats and breath and lifted phones, and the noise had built the way it always builds. A hum, then a buzz, then, far down the avenue toward the cathedral, the first brass note of the founding hymn and the first long roar as the head of the procession stepped off. I want you to understand what my body was doing in those minutes, because it explains why the next part was so hard. I was at attention, eyes level, rifle at the order butt on the stone by my right boot, my right hand curled at the small of it, face shut. The freeze is not a posture you hold, it is a posture you become. 19 years of it had made stillness my native country and motion a foreign language I had to translate before I could speak it. To break the freeze on a founding day, in front of 500,000 people and the crown, without an order, there is no word in our service for how forbidden that is. Men have been broken from the guard for far less. Men have been broken from the guard for swaying. And the crossing was sound. I had walked it myself at 5 that morning with the route master, the way I had walked it every founding day for 19 years. I had checked the fountain rail and the cobbles and the drains. I had checked the great reviewing stand, 60 feet of timber and gilded bunting that the Office of Ceremonies threw up every autumn for the dignitaries and the diplomatic guests. And the foreman had signed the load card and shown me the steel under the skirting, and the stand had been full of 150 seated guests since 8 o'clock, and it had not so much as creaked. So the crossing was sound, the column was coming, and my body was a closed door. That is the situation. Hold it in your mind. The head of the procession reached me at 9:20. The household cavalry first on the big blacks, 2 by 2, the steel of their breastplates throwing the broken sun back into the crowd. Then the band, then the standards, then a long bright ribbon of the realm's regiments, and the roar moving with them like weather. I did not move. The horse's hooves struck the cobbles in that huge slow 4-beat that you feel in your chest before you hear it, and the crowd pressed the barriers, and somewhere a baby cried and was hushed, and a man near me said to his son, here they come, look. And still, far back, not yet at the bend, the open landau with the Queen. It was in that gap, after the cavalry had passed and before the carriage came, the one stretch of the morning where the crossing was briefly almost quiet, that I first looked at the girl. She was at the very front, jammed against the iron at the corner where the barrier turned to follow the bend, no more than 15 feet from my boots. 6, perhaps 7 years old. A red wool coat a little too big, the sleeves turned back, dark hair under a knitted cap. And while every other child along that rail was leaning out and waving and shouting at the soldiers, this one stood square to the avenue with both hands flat on the top rail and her chin lifted, looking not at the horses, not at the band, not at me, but up and across, at the great reviewing stand, with an expression on her small face that I had seen exactly twice before in my life, and both of those times had been on the faces of grown men in a very bad hour. It was the face of someone who has understood something terrible before anyone has told her she is allowed to. I will tell you about the 2 other times later, because they belong to this story, and because one of them is the reason I did not look away. For now, know only that the expression registered on me the way a wrong note registers on a man who has heard the symphony 1,000 times. I did not yet know what was wrong. I knew that something was. The freeze held me. Of course it held me. A child with a serious face is not a reason to break a march, and a guard who broke for every serious face would never finish a single ceremony. I kept my eyes level. I let her sit at the edge of my vision the way you let a thing sit when you have not decided what it is. The carriage was coming. I could hear the change in the crowd's roar that meant the Queen had come round the cathedral end and the people there had seen her. And then the girl moved, and it was the way she moved that turned my blood. She did not wave. She did not point. Pointing is what an excited child does, an arm flung out, look. She did none of that. Slowly, deliberately, keeping her eyes on me now and only on me, she lifted her right hand off the rail, held it up flat with the palm toward me, fingers together, and then drew it slowly across in front of her body, left to right, low, close to her chest, and brought it back to the rail and pressed it down again. Flat. Held. I felt the hair stand on my arms inside the red wool. Because that is a signal. That precise gesture, palm out, the flat hand drawn level across the body, then pressed down, is not a child's wave, and it is not a thing a child invents. It is, very nearly, the arm and hand sign our own dismounted drill uses for halt and steady, the sign a section commander throws over his shoulder when he wants the men behind him to stop and freeze without a word. I have made that exact motion 10,000 times. I have had it made at me 10,000 more. and I had never in my life seen it come back at me from the far side of a parade barrier, made by a girl in a red coat too big for her, with a face like the end of the world. She made it again, palm out, flat, across, down, held, and she did not stop looking at me. I want to be precise about what a thing like that does inside a disciplined man, because the discipline is the whole drama and I will not cheapen it. My training said, hold. My training said 100 reasonable things at once, all of them in the patient voice of every instructor I had ever had. It said children copy soldiers. She has seen a film, she has seen the changing of the guard, she is playing at being one of us. It is the sweetest thing on the avenue and it means nothing. It said the crossing is sound, you walked it yourself. The load card is signed, the stand is full and quiet, there is no danger here for her to see. It said you are about to be in front of the crown and 500,000 people. You will not, you cannot, break attention because a small girl is making shapes with her hand. It said the worst thing a guard can do is mistake his own nerves for a warning. Hold, Hale. You are a rock. Holding is the job. And underneath all of that reasonable, patient voice in the older part of me, the part that had stood other posts in other countries before I ever wore the bearskin, something cold and certain said, she is not playing. Look where she is looking. She is not looking at you to be seen. She is looking at you because you are the one with the rifle and the authority and the eyes front, because some animal sense in a 6-year-old has worked out that you are the man whose whole purpose is to stop a thing, and she is using the only language she has found that might reach a statue. She is not asking you to wave back. She is telling you to stop. Stop what? I followed her line. I had not let myself do it yet. I did it now, a single controlled movement of the eyes, level still, just a flick up and across to where she had been staring before she fixed on me. The great reviewing stand. 60 feet of tiered timber draped in the gold and gray bunting of the house, packed with 150 seated guests, ministers, the diplomatic corps, the founding families, the Lord Mayor and his chain, rising in steep rows above the inner curb of the bend. Directly over the 40 feet of cobbles the royal column was about to cross. The most honored seats in the kingdom. The safest, you would think, because the most watched. And I saw nothing. That is the truth, and it is important. At a glance in the broken gold light, with the bunting snapping in the wind off the river, the stand looked exactly as it had looked at 5 that morning when the foreman showed me the steel. 150 people in their best coats, leaning to see the queen come round the bend. Nothing. But the girl was not looking at the people. I made myself see that. Her eyes were lower than the people. They were on the underside, the legs, the dark timber forest of the understructure where the stand's weight ran down into the cobbles, and on one place in particular, the third bay from the corner, where a diagonal brace ran from high on the frame down to a footplate bolted to the stone. I looked at the footplate, and the footplate was not on the stone. It is a small thing to see from 15 feet, across a parade, under a moving crowd, in one stolen flick of the eyes. A man could look at it a dozen times and not see it, because the eye expects the timber to meet the ground, and so it draws the ground up to meet the timber. But I had walked that crossing at 5 o'clock. I had crouched at those footplates with the foreman's torch on them. And the third brace from the corner, the one carrying the diagonal load of the whole upper tier on the avenue side, did not have its foot bedded flat on the stone. There was a line of gray morning light under it, a finger's width of daylight between the steel plate and the cobble it was bolted to lift away from. The brace had risen, or the cobble under it had dropped. Either way, the load path that ran down that diagonal had been quietly, invisibly, taken off its footing, and the only thing holding 60 feet of packed timber in its place over the bend was the friction of a joint that was no longer where the load card said it was. I felt the whole morning go very quiet inside me, the way it goes quiet before you do a hard thing. The royal column was 40 seconds from the bend. I could hear the lead horses of the carriage escort on the cobbles now. The crowd's roar was rising to meet the queen. 150 people sat on a structure that I and a 6-year-old girl in a red coat, and apparently no one else in the entire kingdom, could see was no longer bearing its load the way it was built to bear it. And I was a sergeant of the king's guard, frozen at attention, with no order to move in front of the crown, who had been broken from far steadier service for less than a sway. The girl pressed her flat hand down on the rail again, held it, looked at me. I had perhaps 8 seconds to decide whether I believed her. Here is what discipline actually is, and it is not what people watching from the curb think it is. They think it is the not moving, the bare skin, the level eyes, the man who takes the tourist's insult and the camera flash and the rude poking finger and does not so much as breathe wrong. They think discipline is the freeze. The freeze is the easy part. After 19 years, the freeze is rest. The hard part of discipline is the judgment underneath it, the constant, silent weighing of when the freeze is the duty and when the freeze is the failure. Because the rules that hold you still are not there to make you a statue. They are there because most of the time, on most days, the still man is the right man, and the man who reacts to every shout and every sudden movement is a danger to the very thing he guards. The rules are right 99 times in 100. The whole agony of the work is the 100th time. I had walked that crossing at 5. I had been shown the steel. The load card was signed by a foreman whose name I knew. Against that stood a finger of gray light under a footplate and the flat-handed signal of a girl too young to read. And I made my decision, and I will tell you exactly how I made it, because it was not faith and it was not a hunch, and it was not the sweetness of a child's face. It was arithmetic, the cold arithmetic they teach you when they teach you to guard a life and not just a gate. The cost of being wrong if I held. If the brace was sound and the girl was only playing, and I held my post and the column passed and nothing happened, the cost was nothing. A pretty morning. A signal I would think about for a week and then forget. The cost of being wrong if I broke. If the brace was sound and I broke the freeze and halted the royal column in front of 500,000 people for a finger of light that turned out to be a trick of the wet stone. The cost was my career, my honor, my 19 years, the Queen's founding day made ridiculous, my name a byword in the mess for the rest of my life. The guard who stopped the king's parade because a little girl waved at him. That was the cost. It was enormous. It was everything I was. And then the other side of the ledger. The cost of being right if I held. 150 people on 60 feet of timber over the bend, and the royal children on their ponies in the 40 feet of cobbles directly below it. At the exact moment the load came onto the bend, and the crowd surged the barriers, and the band's bass drum hit the great beat that I had felt shake that stand every founding day for 19 years. I did not finish that thought. You do not have to finish that thought. The arithmetic is not close. When one side of the ledger is your honor and the other side is a stand full of people and 2 children coming down onto the cobbles beneath it, there is no sum in which your honor outweighs them. A man who thinks his honor outweighs them has not understood what his honor is for. That is the whole of it. That is why I moved. Not because I was sure she was right, I was not sure. But because the price of treating her as right and being wrong was a thing I could pay, and the price of treating her as wrong and being right was a thing no one could pay back. I broke the freeze. I want to describe it slowly because it happened fast, and because every man in the service who has heard this story has asked me the same thing. How? What did you do first? In what order? And the order saved it. I did not run to the stand. A running guard is a panic, and a panic moves a crowd, and a moved crowd at that barrier would have done the stand's work for it. I did the opposite of running. I came out of the order arms in one clean motion, brought my heels together, and executed the halt and attention signal of the dismounted drill. The same flat hand the girl had thrown at me, palm out, drawn level, held, but I threw it up the avenue, toward the bend, toward the route master's post and the mounted escort sergeant whose eyes I knew would be on the crossing because that is his whole job at the bend. It is a signal that means, in our drill, halt and stand fast, and it is a signal that exactly 4 men on that avenue were trained to read and obey without question and without a word. The escort sergeant, the 2 route marshals at the fountain, and the color sergeant at the head of the household detachment. I had thrown it 10,000 times in drill. I had never once thrown it on a live founding day. The instant my hand came up, I had committed everything I was to the finger of gray light under a footplate. The escort sergeant, a hard, careful man named Bram Tolliver, 20 years in, who had stood more bends than I had, saw it across 40 feet of cobbles, and I watched his face do the thing a professional's face does, which is nothing. He did not gape. He did not question. He read the signal. He read that it had come from the senior man on the crossing, and he made his own instant arithmetic, which was simpler than mine. Hale has thrown halt and stand fast on a live route. Hale does not do that for nothing. The lead horses of the carriage escort were 6 lengths from the bend and closing. Tolliver reined back and threw up his own arm, and the column began to stop. You have perhaps never seen a mounted royal column halt from the inside. From the curb it looks like a single thing, but it is not. It is 40 horses and 100 men, each pair reading the pair ahead, the order flowing back up the line faster than a shout could carry it, horse after horse coming up short and tossing, the slow forebeat of the hooves breaking and stumbling into the ragged clatter of a stop, and the band, who could not see the signal, playing on for 3 more bars over the top of it before the bandmaster felt the column die behind him and dragged the founding hymn to a halt on a sour, trailing note that I will hear in my sleep until I die. And in the half-second of silence that fell after the music stopped, while 500,000 people drew the same breath of confusion, I heard, very clearly from the front row at the corner, a small voice say one word. There. The girl had taken her hand off the rail at last. She was pointing now, pointing with her whole arm, the way an excited child points, except there was nothing excited in it, straight at the 3rd bay of the reviewing stand, at the footplate, at the finger of gray light. And as I turned to follow her arm, with the column stopped behind me and the Queen's carriage drawn up short 40 feet from the bend, and 100,000 pairs of eyes swinging from the silenced band to the frozen guard who had somehow stopped the King's parade, the wind came up off the river in a long gust, and the great reviewing stand, 60 feet of packed timber, 150 souls, the gold and gray bunting cracking like sails, leaned. Just an inch, just enough. A long groan of stressed timber that everyone on the avenue heard at once, and the front row of guests stopped looking at me and looked up and began, slowly, then not slowly, to understand. A leaning is a strange thing to watch a crowd of dignified people receive. They had come in their best coats to be seen on the most honored seats in the realm, and for a long moment after that groan of timber, not one of them moved, because moving would have been undignified, and because the human mind on a beautiful morning will do extraordinary work to keep believing the morning is still beautiful. A minister in the 2nd row actually laughed, a short nervous bark, and said something to his neighbor about the wind, and adjusted his chain. I did not have the luxury of that work. I knew what the groan was. The brace had not failed yet. That was the only mercy in the whole arithmetic, but the load had begun to find the gap, the way water finds a crack, and a structure that has started to move toward a failure does not move back on its own. It moves the other way faster, the moment anything adds to the load. And there were 2 things that were about to add to the load, the wind, which I could not stop, and the people who I could. Because the worst thing 150 frightened people can do on a leaning stand is exactly what frightened people do, which is all stand up and lurch the same direction at once. I came off my post. There is no other way to say it, and I have never tried to dress it up. I left the St. Vesper crossing, the post I had held for 19 years and was understanding orders never to leave on a ceremonial day except by the death of myself or the king, and I went up the inner curb toward the stand at the fast, flat, controlled walk we use, when we must move quickly through people without making them run. And I used the only tool a king's guard truly has, which is not the rifle. It is the voice. We almost never use it. That is its power. A guard who has stood silent through every insult and every camera and every shouted question for 19 years has, in reserve, a voice that the crowd has never heard, and when it comes, it lands like a thing from another world. I pitched it from the bottom of my chest, the parade ground command voice, flat and enormous and without a tremor of fear in it, because the men below me would take their fear from mine, and I had decided they would have none. Reviewing stand, on your feet, move to the rear and DOWN the back stair, walk, do not push, row by row from the front, on ME. I have been asked since whether I was afraid in that moment, and the honest answer is that fear had become irrelevant, the way it does when the task is large enough. There was no room left in me for it. There was only the sequence. Front rows first, because the front of the stand overhung the bend and the front was the killing edge. Back stair, because the back stair ran down onto the wide pavement away from the column and the horses. Row by row, because a stand emptied in order empties faster in lives, and a stand emptied in panic jams its own stairs and dies. I had drilled crowd clearance 100 times in my first service, in a life before the bearskin, and the drill came up out of me whole and cold and exact. For one heartbeat nothing happened, and that heartbeat was the longest of my life. 150 people looked down at a single guard in a red tunic with his hand up, and the whole thing balanced on whether they would obey a voice or argue with it. Then the front row stood and moved, and the rest of them followed, because that is the other secret of a crowd. It desperately wants to be told what to do, and it will follow the first calm, certain voice it hears, and I had made certain that voice was mine. Tolliver had read it all from the bend. He did not need an order either. He swung 4 men of the escort off their horses and up the back stair against the flow, not to clear it but to steady it, a guardsman at each turn of the timber with a hand out in a flat hard walk. Walk this way, you're safe, walk. And the line of frightened dignitaries went down past them in a long obedient ribbon instead of a falling crush. The route marshals had the lower barrier open and the pavement clear. Somebody, I learned later it was the route master, an old soldier named Hessam who had stood beside me at 5 that morning, had got to the carriage and turned the royal column hard about, away from the bend, the escort wheeling the open landau and the 2 gray ponies back up the avenue the way they had come, putting 40 more feet and then 60 more between the children and the stand with every passing second. I stayed at the foot of the front stair, where the load was, and I counted them down. That was my post now. I had traded a crossing for a stair, and I counted heads down it, the way I had counted off the watch for 19 years, and somewhere in the counting, I understood that the girl in the red coat was no longer at the barrier where I had left her, and I could not look for her, because looking for her would have cost me the count, and the count was 150 lives. I will tell you now about the 2 other times I had seen that face, the face the girl wore, because the count took 4 minutes, and the mind does strange things in 4 minutes when the body is on a task, and what my mind did was go back. The first time was a long way from Eldermoor, in the service I had before the guard, on a gray morning not unlike this one, when I was young and a corporal, and we were clearing a row of old market buildings that the engineers had condemned, and the people had not yet left. There was a man, a baker, who would not go, who stood in the doorway of his shop and argued with my sergeant about his ovens, and behind the baker in the dark of the shop, a boy of about 9 sat on a flour sack and watched, and the boy had the face. The understanding before permission face. The boy had felt the building move in the night the way the old feel weather in a knee, and he knew, and no one would listen to a boy, and he sat on his flour sack and watched the grown men argue with the patience of someone who has already grieved. We got them out. Barely. The frontage came down 9 minutes later and took the doorway the baker had been standing in. I have never forgotten the boy's face, and I had not seen it again, not once in 20 years. until a girl in a red coat threw it at me across a parade barrier. The second time I will keep for later, because it is the heart of this and you are not ready for it yet, and because at that moment, counting heads down a stair, I did not let myself think it either. I thought of the baker's boy. I thought someone listened that morning just barely, just in time, and I counted. 140, 148. The last guests came off the front rows, an old woman with a cane who would not be hurried and whom I did not hurry, because the front was nearly clear and her dignity was the last thing she had and I would not take it. And then the front 3 bays of the great reviewing stand stood empty over the bend, and the killing edge held no one, and I let myself breathe one breath. That was the moment the brace let go. It did not explode. People imagine these things explode, they do not. There was a single hard crack, like a great branch breaking, and then the long, terrible descending groan of timber finding the ground it had been kept from, and the front 3 bays of the reviewing stand folded down and forward into the empty cobbles of the bend, in a slow leaning collapse that threw up a billow of gray dust, and a clatter of falling chairs, and a snapping rope of bunting that whipped out across the barrier where, 4 minutes before, a girl in a red coat had pressed her flat hand to the iron. Empty, it came down on empty cobbles. The front rows that would have been crushed were 100 feet up the avenue and still walking. The royal column that would have been beneath it was turned about and gone. 150 people stood on the far pavement and watched the seats they had been sitting in fold into the road, and the sound that came out of them was not a scream. It was a long collective moan, the sound a crowd makes when it understands, all at once, the size of the thing that did not happen to it. I stood at the foot of the empty stair with the dust settling on my white gloves and my bearskin, and I did not move, because there was nothing left to do that moving would help, and because 19 years had taught my body that when the task is done, the stillness comes back on its own. And then the avenue was full of running men, and the noise came back like a tide, and the slow part of the morning was over. Now here is the turn that most people who tell this story get wrong, because they want it to end here. They want the stand to fall on empty cobbles and the guard to be a hero and the girl to be found and thanked, and the morning to close on the cheer that did, eventually, go up. But it did not end there, and I would not let it end there. And the reason is the thing that had been sitting wrong in me since 5 o'clock that morning and had nothing to do with the girl at all. The foreman had shown me the steel. I keep coming back to it because I could not stop coming back to it, standing in the dust. At 5 that morning, the foreman of the Office of Ceremonies, a man named Garrick Voss, whom I had known for 6 founding days, careful, dull, reliable, the sort of man who carries his load card in a plastic sleeve, had walked the stand with me and shown me, with his torch, the steel footplates bedded flat on the cobbles and bolted home. I had crouched at that 3rd brace. I had seen the plate flat on the stone. I would have sworn to it before any board in the kingdom. A footplate bolted flat to the stone at 5 in the morning does not rise a finger's width off its bedding by 9:20 on its own. Timber moves. It shrinks and swells with the damp. A green frame settles. But a steel plate bolted home does not lift off bolted stone in 4 hours because of the weather. Something had moved it. Something had taken the load off that footing between the time Voss showed me the steel and the time a 6-year-old saw the gap. And a thing that is done in those 4 hours, between the inspection and the parade, on the one footing carrying the whole avenue-side load of the stand directly over the spot where the crown's children would pass, is not the weather. I did not say this to anyone in the first hour. You do not say a thing like that in the first hour. In the first hour you stand your ground and you let the doctors and the engineers and the senior officers flood the avenue, and you give your account flat and exact to the captain of the guard when he comes. And Captain Aldous Wren came fast, white-faced, and the first thing he said to me was not well done. The first thing he said was, "Who gave you the order to leave your post?" I told him the truth. "No one, sir. I broke the freeze on my own judgment." And Wren looked at the fallen stand and at the empty cobbles, and at the royal column drawn up safe 200 feet away with the queen already on her feet in the landau looking back down the avenue toward me, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that told me he was a real soldier and not just a man with a rank. He said, "Then you'll account for it to a board and I'll stand beside you when you do. But not yet. Walk with me." We walked to the fallen brace. The engineers were already there, and they parted for the captain, and I crouched again at the third footing where I had crouched at 5 o'clock, and this time there was no torch needed because the morning was full gold now, and I saw what had been done. The bolts were gone. Not sheared, not pulled through. Gone, backed out clean, the threads bright, 4 hardened bolts that had held the steel footplate to the embedded anchor in the cobble, every one of them turned out and lying. And this is the detail that I have never been able to forget, lying neatly together in a row in the shadow of the timber, set down by a careful hand, the way a careful man sets down screws he means to keep. The plate had been left resting on its anchor, balanced, so that at a glance, in torchlight, it looked seated, so that it would look seated to a foreman with a load card, so that it would carry the dead weight of an empty stand all morning and hold through the load coming on as the guests filed in, and let go, under the live surge, at the precise moment the avenue side load came onto the bend, which is to say, at the precise moment the royal column passed beneath it. I have built my life on the difference between the thing that fails and the thing that is failed. The boys' building, 20 years ago, fell because it was old and condemned, and no one had the money to save it. That is the thing that fails. This was the thing that is failed. Someone had unbolted the load path of the most honored stand in the realm, in the 4 hours between my inspection and the parade, and balanced the plate so it would look whole, and walked away, and they had not done it to bring down a stand full of ministers. A man who wanted ministers could have chosen any of 60 footings. They had done it to the one footing that carried the load over the bend. On the morning the crown's children would ride the bend on 2 gray ponies, at the one moment of the one day when half the realm was watching the wrong thing. Captain Wren crouched beside me and looked at the 4 bright bolts in their neat shadow row, and I watched him understand it the same way I had, and I watched the color drain a second time out of a face that had already gone white once that morning. "Sergeant," he said, very low so the engineers would not hear, "where is the girl?" And I realized, with a cold that went deeper than anything the morning had yet put in me, that I did not know, and that the same careful hand that had backed out 4 bolts and set them down in a row had been on this avenue, in this crowd all morning. And the only person in the entire kingdom who had seen the danger before it fell was a child, alone, somewhere in 500,000 people, who had now done the one thing that might have made that careful hand notice her. She had pointed at it. I told Wren everything in 90 seconds, standing over the bolts, the red coat, the signal, the flat hand where she had stood, that she had said there, and pointed with her whole arm at the third bay in front of 100,000 people. And I watched a hard practical fear settle over him, the fear of a man who guards a house and has just understood that the person who saved that house is a small girl who has made herself the most visible witness in the kingdom to a crime that someone planned in silence. "Find her," he said, quietly. "No uniforms charging the crowd. You saw her, you go, take toll of her. I'll hold the scene and I'll get the queen behind the gates." He gripped my arm once hard, the only time in 6 years he ever touched me. "Hale, the same hands that did this are still here. Bring her in before they decide a 6-year-old saw too much." I have stood a great many posts in my life, and I have never moved off one with the speed I came off that fallen stair. Tolliver fell in beside me out of the dust, his horse handed off, and the 2 of us went into the crowd at the corner, not the parade ground walk now but the low fast weave of men hunting a face, our red tunics parting the press, people grabbing at us. Are the children safe? Was anyone under it? What happened? And the 2 of us saying nothing, scanning for a red coat too big and a knitted cap and a face like the end of the world. The crowd at the bend was 30,000 strong and coming apart in every direction at once, some pushing toward the fallen stand to see, some fleeing it, families calling names, marshals shouting, and somewhere in that churning sea was a girl the height of a fence post who had been at the barrier 4 minutes ago and could be anywhere now. A worse place to find one child you could not invent. "Talk to me," Tolliver said low as we worked the front rail. "What have we got, lost in the crowd or taken?" "I don't know," I said, and the not knowing was the whole horror of it. "We found her coat first." That is the moment the morning nearly broke me, and I will be plain about it. Tolliver's eye caught it, a flash of red wool on the cobbles 40 feet down the rail from where she had stood, trodden, half under a barrier foot. A child's red coat, the sleeves turned back, exactly as I had seen it. He had it up in his fist before I reached him, and we both stood there with the cold thought between us, the coat off and the child gone, which is the thing every guard who has ever hunted a missing child dreads to find. And then Tolliver turned the coat over and let out a breath, because there was no harm on it, no tear, no blood, nothing but the dust of the avenue and a child's name written in marker on the inside of the collar in a careful adult hand. The way a parent writes a name in a coat, so a school will know whose it is. The name was Wren. "She took it off," I said, relief and fear at once. "She was hot or she was running and she shed it. Children shed coats. I had a daughter once. I knew how a coat comes off a running child like a skin. She's not taken. She's loose." "Loose in 30,000, Tolliver said, "with somebody who might want her not to be." We had a name now, and a name is a hook. Tolliver put it on the marshal's net, a girl, 6 or 7, dark hair, knitted cap, answers to Wren, last seen front rail at the bend. Do not alarm, hold and signal. And the word went out across the marshal channel low and fast, the machine of the route turning its eyes from the fallen stand to the small loose child. And for 90 seconds the whole apparatus of a founding day bent itself to finding one girl, and I let myself believe it would be quick. It was not quick. The marshals had a dozen lost children that morning. They always do. A parade sheds children the way an autumn tree sheds leaves, and a dozen frightened sets of parents were already at the lost children point under the cathedral end. And somewhere in the crosstalk a marshal said he had a dark-haired girl in a cap, hold, and my heart came up into my throat. And then he said, "No, this one's crying for her mother and her name's Posy. Stand down," and the morning ground on. And here is the false dawn, the moment it looked solved and was not. A woman came through the crowd toward us at the bend, fast, frantic, exactly the way a mother moves, calling the name Wren, Wren. And the marshals brought her to me because I was the man hunting the same name, and she was perhaps 35, well-dressed, a good coat, a steady, educated voice gone ragged with fear, and she said she was the girl's aunt, that she'd had the child by the hand at the rail and lost her in the surge when the stand came down, that she'd been searching 20 minutes, please, had we seen her. A red coat, and I had the red coat in Tolliver's fist, and I held it up, and the woman's face broke into such pure relief at the sight of it that, for one full breath, I believed her completely, and felt the whole knotted morning begin to come loose. The witness found an aunt, a surge, a shed coat, a frightened child who would be back in a known pair of arms inside the hour and safe behind a name and a family, and the careful hands with their 4 bolts a matter for the captain and the boards and not for a 6-year-old at all. I held the coat out to her. And Tolliver, Bram Tolliver, 20 years in, who had stood more bends than I had, did not let go of it. He kept his fist closed on the red wool, and he said, in the mild, flat voice we use when we are buying a second to think, "What's the name in the collar, then?" The woman's eyes flicked to the coat, to the collar, and there was a half-second, no more, but I have lived inside that half-second many times since, where she did not know. Where a real aunt, a real mother, anyone who had ever dressed that child for a cold morning and written her name in her coat with a careful hand, would have said it without a thought, the way you say your own name. And this woman's clever, frantic, well-dressed face went, for that half-second, perfectly, calculatingly still, the still of someone reading the room and computing the answer before she said warmly, certainly. Wren, of course, her name's Wren, it's there in the collar, you can see it. Which is what the Marshall Channel had said 90 seconds before on the open net. Answers to Wren. She had not read it off the coat, she had read it off the air. I looked at Tolliver and Tolliver looked at me, and neither of us moved a muscle of our faces, and the false dawn went out like a snuffed candle, and the morning was colder and far worse than it had been a minute before, because the woman in the good coat reaching for the child's coat with such perfect relief did not know the child's name, and was very calm about a brace that should have made her frantic, and had come to us, to the men hunting the girl, to be handed the girl. Of course, I said, and I made my voice as warm and stupid and relieved as hers. Of course, she can't be far. Walk with us, ma'am, we'll find her together. And the hunt for one small loose girl in a crowd of 30,000 became, in that half-second over a collar, a far more dangerous thing. A race between the men who wanted to save her and the woman who wanted to reach her first. And the woman had been on this avenue all morning, and knew where the child had last been seen, and was now, with a tender, frantic face, walking willingly at my side toward the very place I most needed to go. I had to think faster than I have ever thought, and I had to do it while making small, warm, reassuring noises to a woman I now believed was hunting a child. The arithmetic again. If I seized her, a guard grabbing a frantic ant, in front of 30,000 shaken people, with no proof but a half-second over a collar, I would be the brute who manhandled a grieving woman on Founding Day, and worse. If I was wrong, I would have wasted the one chance to find Wren on a mistake, and if I was right, the act of seizing her would tell her exactly what we knew and might leave a Confederate free to reach the girl first. And I did not know if she was alone. The hands at the bolts had been careful and patient. Careful, patient people do not always work alone. So I did not seize her. I did the thing that is hardest of all for a man built to act, which is to keep still inside the motion. I walked her with us, warm and stupid, and I used her. Because she wanted to find Wren, and so did I, and she was very good at it. She scanned the crowd with a hunter's eyes that no real ant has, and I let her lead, half a step, and I watched where her attention went, and her attention did not sweep the lost children point under the cathedral where a sensible ant would go. It went the other way, away from the Marshalls, toward the river side of the avenue, toward the mouth of a service lane behind the fallen stand where the Office of Ceremonies kept its vans and its timber and its tools. She was not searching the crowd at all. She was making for a place. She thought she knew where the girl had gone. And the reason she thought she knew, I realized, was that she had watched the girl too, all morning. The way I would learn she had watched her for 3 days. The careful hand with the bolts had needed to know one thing above all, that no one was watching the third bay, and the one creature on the avenue who had been watching the third bay was a 6-year-old who could not stop looking at the wrong that no one else could see. The woman had clocked the staring child the way a thief clocks the one honest face in a market. She had not feared a guard. She had feared the girl. And when the girl pointed, when Wren flung her whole arm at the third bay in front of 100,000 people, the woman had gone after her. I said easily to Tolliver in the flat drill talk that sounds like nothing, "I'll take the lane side, you take the rail. Cover the cathedral point in case she's gone to the Marshalls." It is a sentence that means nothing to a civilian. To Tolliver it meant, "She's making for the service lane, I'm going with her, you peel off and bring force around the back of it, low and quiet." He said, "Right you are, Sergeant," and faded into the crowd, and the woman did not so much as glance after him, because she had decided I was the slow, warm, useful one and Tolliver was furniture. And that misjudgment was the first mistake she made that morning and the one that cost her. We came out of the press at the mouth of the service lane, the woman and I, and the lane ran back along the rear of the collapsed stand between the parked vans and a long stack of festival timber. And it was quieter here, the roar of the crowd, a wall behind us, and the woman's frantic face was working harder now to stay frantic because we were close and she could feel it. And at the far end of the lane, behind the wheel of a timber van, half hidden in the shadow of the stacked planks with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and her dark hair loose without its cap, and no coat against the cold, sat Wren. She saw us at the same instant we saw her. And here is the thing I will carry to my grave. She did not look at the woman, the grown-up coming down the lane with her arms half out and her voice going, "There you are. Oh, thank goodness, there you are." She looked at me. Past the woman, straight at me, the man in the red tunic, the man with the rifle and the authority and the eyes front, the statue she had reached across a barrier 4 minutes and a lifetime ago. And on her small face was the same expression as before, understanding before permission. She knew exactly what the woman was. She had known longer than I had. And she lifted her flat hand off her knee, palm out, and drew it level across her chest low and pressed it down. "Halt, steady, stop." She was telling me to stop the woman. The woman saw the girl's eyes go past her to me, and she was clever. She was so clever, and she understood in that instant that the warm, slow furniture had not been furniture at all, and she lunged the last 6 feet for the child. I was already moving. I had been moving, in the part of me that had decided this in the crowd, since the half-second over the collar. A king's guard does not draw his rifle on a woman in a crowd. That is not what the moment needed, and it is not who we are. What the moment needed was a body between a grown adult and a 6-year-old, and a body is the thing I had been trained for 19 years to make immovable. I crossed in front of the woman in one long step and set myself, heels apart, weight down, the way you set yourself to take a horse, not a person. And she ran into a wall of red wool and bone and 19 years of standing fast, and she rebounded off me and went down hard onto the cobbles of the lane. And I did not strike her. I never struck her. I simply did not move. The way I had not moved for 19 years, except that this time the not moving was aimed. "Wren," I said, not loudly, not taking my eyes off the woman on the ground. "Stay where you are behind me. You did everything right." And Tolliver came around the end of the timber stack with 2 root marshals, and the woman in the good coat looked up from the cobbles at 3 men in red, and the game went out of her face all at once, the franticant mask coming off like a coat shed by a running child, and underneath it was nothing warm at all. Just the cold reading calculation I had seen for that half-second over the collar, the face of someone computing a new sum now that the old one had failed. "You don't understand," she said, and her voice had changed to lower level reasonable. "I meant to take the child. There are people who—" and she stopped herself, because even now, even down on the stone, she was too disciplined to finish the sentence in front of witnesses. And that single bitten off, "There are people who told me more than a confession would have." She had not been alone, and the people behind her were not, I understood with a fresh cold, finished for the day just because a stand had come down on empty cobbles. A plan that careful does not have one moving part. It has fallbacks. And the fallback, the human fallback for the one thing they could not control, the witness, was sitting behind me in the shadow of a timber stack with her knees drawn up, 6 years old, the only person in the realm who could say what she had seen and when and who had been near the third bay. I crouched slowly, keeping my body between Wren and the woman and the lane, and I came down to the height of a small girl the way I had come down once to the height of a boy on a flour sack 20 years before, and I said, "My name is Corwen. You signaled me. I saw it. The stand came down and it hurt no one because of you. Now I am going to keep you safe, and I need you to do one more brave thing. I need you to tell me what you saw but not here. Will you walk with me behind these men somewhere warm?" And Wren looked at the woman on the cobbles, and then at me, and she put her cold small hand into my white glove, and she said the second thing she ever said to me, in a clear small voice that I have never forgotten. It wasn't just her. There was a man with the tools. He's still here. I've given my account of that morning to 3 separate boards of inquiry, and every one of them has fixed on the same question. How could a child of 6 know what she knew? And the answer, which took me the rest of that day and a great deal of the days after to understand, is both simpler and stranger than the boards wanted. Wren had not understood the plot. She was 6. She did not know what a load path was, or a footplate, or a fallback. What she had was the one thing the careful hands had not planned for: 3 mornings of patient watching by a child with nothing else to do. I learned it later in pieces, sitting beside her with a blanket round her shoulders and a mug of something warm in her hands, while the gentlest woman in the guard's whole household wing wrote down every word. Wren's grandmother had a flower stall at the river end of the avenue, under the cathedral, and Wren had spent the 3 mornings before founding day there while her grandmother sold chrysanthemums to the early crowds. And from the flower stall, a bored child could see the whole rear of the reviewing stand as the Office of Ceremonies built and dressed it. And on each of those 3 mornings, Wren had watched a man in the gray coveralls of the office come to the stand when the other workers were on their break, alone with a tool bag, and crouch at the same place at the front corner and work and put things in his pocket and go. 3 mornings, always the same corner, always alone, always when no one watched. A grown person who saw that would have thought, a workman finishing a job. A child who saw it thought, that man does his work in secret, and secret work is the kind you are not supposed to do, and I am the only one who sees. She did not know it was sabotage. She knew it was wrong, the understanding before permission. And on founding day morning, jammed at the front rail with her grandmother somewhere behind, she had looked up at the 3rd bay where the secret man always worked, and seen, with the eyes of a child who had stared at that corner for 3 days, the one thing different about it: the gap of gray light under the plate that no adult on the avenue would ever notice because no adult had spent 3 mornings memorizing how it was supposed to look. So she had done the only thing a 6-year-old can do when she sees a wrong that no grown-up will believe. She had found the grown-up whose whole job, visibly, obviously, was to stop wrong things, the man in red with the rifle who stood guard, and she had reached him in the only language that might pierce a statue. She had copied us. She had seen the changing of the guard, as every child in the capital has. She had watched us signal each other with our flat, hard hands, and she had thrown our own halt back at me across the iron, over and over, until the statue moved. I tell you this now, out of order, because you should know it before the last of it, and because the boards needed 3 sittings to believe a thing that I believed the moment her cold hand went into my glove: that the most dangerous plot the kingdom had seen in a generation was undone by a florist's granddaughter who was simply paying attention, and by a guard whose entire training had taught him, at last, to pay attention to her. But that was later. In the lane, with her cold hand in mine, and the woman in the good coat held face down on the cobbles by Tolliver's knee, what mattered was 4 words: he's still here. A man with the tools, the gray coveralls of the Office of Ceremonies, which was why no one had looked at him twice in 3 days, and why no one was looking at him now, in the churning aftermath of a collapse, when the avenue was full of men in exactly those coveralls swarming the fallen timber. The single best place in the entire kingdom to be a saboteur that morning was inside the cleanup of his own sabotage, in the uniform of the people putting it right. "Wren," I said, "the man with the tools, can you see him? Don't point. Just tell me." She looked down the lane and out toward the wreck of the stand where the gray coveralls swarmed, and she was quiet a long moment, and then she said, "He has a yellow on his hat. The others don't. He put a yellow tape on his hat so the lady could find him." I have thought many times about the gap between the people who plan these things and the people who must carry them out. The woman in the good coat had been disciplined enough to bite off her own confession, but somewhere in the plan, a man crouching at a brace in the dark had been frightened enough, or junior enough, of being lost in a crowd of identical coveralls that he had marked his own hard hat with a strip of yellow tape so his handler could pick him out. A small human failure. The same kind of small human truth that had written a child's name in a coat collar. The careful plots fail on the small human things every time, and they are undone by the people who notice them. A guard who notices a finger of light, a child who notices a yellow tape. I passed it to Tolliver in the flat drill talk, and Tolliver passed it to the marshal net, and Captain Wren, who had the Queen behind the palace gates by now, and the whole apparatus of the guard turned to the avenue. Captain Wren took a strip of yellow tape on a hard hat and turned it into the quietest manhunt I have ever seen. No charge, no shout. 4 men of the guard in plain coats, walking the cleanup, converging on a coverall with a yellow-taped hat who was at that moment, I would learn, doing the most chilling thing of all, helping to lift the fallen timber, searching the wreckage, looking with great apparent diligence for any small body that might be under it, looking for Wren, in case the stand had taken her after all, in case the fallback was not needed. They had him in 90 seconds between 2 vans, without a soul in the crowd ever knowing a man had been taken, and the tool bag he still carried held a battery driver, and a socket sized to the 4 bright bolts that lay in their neat row in the shadow of the 3rd brace. And it was not over even then, because a man taken is a man who talks, and a woman who bites off her confession is a woman who has someone to protect, and the thing they had tried to do, I will not dress it in mystery, because the boards have ruled on it and the ruling is part of the record, was not in the end about ministers or even about the crown as a symbol. It was about the succession. There was, in the founding families, a line that stood to gain a very great deal if the direct heirs of the House of Harrowgate did not survive to inherit. A cousin's branch, patient and well-funded and respectable, who would never have lifted a finger themselves, who had instead found careful hands and a frightened workman and a clever woman, and aimed a falling stand at the one stretch of cobbles, on the one morning, where a 10-year-old prince and an 8-year-old princess would ride 2 gray ponies beneath it in front of a watching realm. An accident, a tragic structural failure on founding day, a grieving kingdom, and a respectable cousin's branch untouched, a step closer to a throne. That is what a finger of gray light under a footplate meant. That is what Wren had been looking at with her end-of-the-world face across the iron barrier. Not a hazard, a throne being reached for through the bodies of 2 children on ponies. And the only thing that had stood between that reaching hand and those 2 children was a guard who had spent 19 years learning to be a statue, and who had, in the 100th case, the case the whole agony of the work is for, finally learned the harder discipline, to break the statue, on the word of a child, without an order and without hesitation. I told you at the start that I had seen Wren's face twice before in my life, and that the second time was the heart of this, and that you were not ready for it. You are ready now. The second time was my own daughter, Eilith, who would have been a grown woman now, and who died at the age of 9 of a fever that came on in a single night, 12 years before that founding day, in the years between the service I had before the guard and the bearskin I took up after. I will not make a long grief of it here. This is not that kind of story, and she would not have wanted it to be. But I will tell you that on the last clear evening before the fever took her down past words, she had looked at me from her bed with an expression I did not have a name for then and have a name for now. Understanding before permission. The child who knows the terrible thing before the grown-ups will say it aloud. And she had reached for my hand. And I, a soldier, a man trained to act, had not known what she was telling me, and had told her she would be well by morning because that was the reasonable thing. The patient thing, the thing all the patient voices say, and she had not been well by morning. I took the bearskin after that. People think a man becomes a king's guard out of love of country, and there is that, and it is real. But the truer thing, for me, was that I had failed once to read a face that was telling me something, in the 1 hour it mattered, and I had spent 19 years learning to read faces, to stand still in a sea of them and miss nothing, to be the man who notices, so that I would never fail to read one again. So when a girl in a red coat threw my daughter's face at me across an iron barrier and reached for me in the only language she had, I want to be honest about the last grain of the arithmetic, the one I did not put in the ledger at the time because a man does not in 8 seconds name the thing that drives him. I broke the freeze for the cold sum of lives. That is true, and it is enough. But underneath the sum, in the older part of me, was a girl in a bed 12 years gone, reaching for a hand, and a father who had been still when he should have moved, and who had sworn in the silence after that if a child ever reached for him again with that face he would move if it cost him everything. It cost me a board of inquiry, 3 of them in the end. I stood before the first one for leaving my post on a ceremonial day without an order, the gravest charge that can be laid against a man of the guard. 11 days after founding day, in the long oak room beneath the palace, and I gave my account flat and exact, and Captain Aldous Wren stood beside me as he had promised. And when the senior member of the board asked me whether I understood that a guard who breaks his post on the strength of a child's gesture invites chaos, whether I understood what it would mean if every man on the line decided for himself when the rules did not apply, I said yes. I understood it completely. I said that the rules that held me still were right 99 times in 100, and that a man who broke them lightly should be broken from the guard, and that I would have voted to break such a man myself. And then I said the only thing I had to say in my defense, which was that the whole purpose of 19 years of discipline is to make a man fit to be trusted with the 100th case, and that a discipline which cannot tell the 100th case from the 99 is not discipline at all, only obedience, and obedience is not what the king's guard is for. The board was still out when the door at the end of the oak room opened, and the Queen came in. Queen Saralyn did not often attend a board of inquiry. It is not the crown's place to weigh the discipline of the guard, and she knew it, and she did not sit. She stood at the back in plain gray, and she asked the board's leave to say one thing, and the board, on its feet, gave it. And she said that she had been in the open landau 40 feet from the bend when the column halted, that she had felt the stop run up the line before she heard the music die, that she had looked back down the avenue and seen one of her guardsmen standing alone at the foot of an emptying stand with his hand up and his face shut, holding 150 people in order with nothing but his voice, and that her son and her daughter were, that morning, alive and at their lessons, because that man had decided that the word of a child at a barrier was worth more than his own honor. The discipline of this guard, she said, is the most precious thing my house owns, and I will not have it cheapened by a man who breaks his post for a whim. But I will tell you what I saw. I saw a man who had been trained for 19 years to stand still, choose in 8 seconds alone, against every rule that protected him, to be the one thing a statue cannot be, which is brave. If that is a crime, then the crime is the soul of the service, and you must decide what your service is for. I have decided what mine is for. And she inclined her head to me, the Queen of Eldermoor to a sergeant of her guard, which is a thing that is not done, and went out. The board cleared me. They did more than clear me. The record reads commended for conduct in the highest tradition of the guard, and I was made a color sergeant before the year was out, and the cousins branch of the founding families that had reached for a throne through 2 children on ponies was, quietly and completely, and by the patient work of better men than me, unmade, the woman in the good coat, and the man with the yellow tape, and the respectable patient people behind them all answered for it. In courts that did not need a 6-year-old to testify in the end, because 4 bright bolts in a neat row and a battery driver in a tool bag, and the careful unmaking of a load path told the story without her. We kept her out of it. That was the one thing I asked, and it was granted, that Wren never stand in any room and be looked at by the people who had hunted her. A child should not have to carry that. It was enough that she had carried the rest. I see her still. That is the last thing and the best of it, and I will close on it because it is where the mourning truly ended, not in the oak room but a year on. Her grandmother still keeps the flower stall at the river end of the avenue, under the cathedral, and on the anniversary of that founding day I go down there in plain coat, off duty, And I buy chrysanthemums I do not need from an old woman who knows exactly who I am and will not take my money. And Wren, taller now, 7 and a great deal of opinions, sits among the buckets and tells me what she has noticed during the week, because she notices everything still. And I have told her that this is not a curse but a gift, and that there is honorable work in the world for people who see what others miss, and that when she is grown, if she wants it, there will be a place near the crown for a woman who pays attention. She says she will think about it. She is keeping her options open. And every year before I go she does the thing. She has made it ours. She lifts her flat hand, palm out, draws it level across her chest, low, and presses it down. Halt, steady, stop. And every year I bring my own white-gloved hand up, off duty, in a plain coat, an old soldier in a flower stall, and I throw it back to her. Exactly the way I threw it up the avenue to Tolliver on the morning she saved 2 children and a kingdom, and never once raised her voice. It is the only conversation we have ever needed. She tells me to stop. I tell her I heard. And then we both stand still a moment, the way the people who truly understand stillness do, not because we cannot move, but because we have already moved in the 100th case when it mattered without hesitation, and the river goes by, and the chrysanthemums nod in the wind off the water, and the avenue where the parade once halted is only an avenue again, full of ordinary people going about an ordinary day, none of them knowing how close the morning had come, and all of them safe. Which is the whole of what a guard is for.